Some stories refuse to die. They don't vanish when the people who lived them pass away. They linger, whispering between generations, as if the truth itself resists being buried. Tonight, we open an old archive, one that speaks of a family haunted by something they could never explain. A presence that seemed to move through time with them, watching, waiting. This is the story of the Whitmore family, and the curse that no one could escape, and no one could prove. It begins in the late 1920s, in a quiet rural town in the Midwest of the United States. The Whitmores lived in a modest wooden farmhouse at the edge of a dense forest. From the outside, it was ordinary: peeling white paint, a wraparound porch, and fields stretching out into silence. But the silence was deceptive. The matriarch, Eleanor Whitmore, was known as a meticulous woman. She kept journals, dozens of them, documenting the daily rhythm of her life. At first, her entries were simple: notes about the harvest, the changing of seasons, and her children's laughter. But round the year 1932, the tone of her writing shifted. She began describing something she called the visitor. Eleanor claimed she would wake at exactly 3:13 a.m. every night, not 3:12, not 3:14. Always 3:13. At first, she thought it was coincidence. But soon she realized that 3:13 became a marker, a silent alarm she could not ignore. Each night she would hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, moving from one end of the house to the other. She assumed it was her husband until she discovered he was always asleep beside her and moving. One night, Eleanor forced herself to open the bedroom door. She expected to see an intruder, or perhaps a thief. But instead, she described a tall figure, impossibly thin, standing at the end of the hall. Its features were blurred, indistinct, as though its face had been erased. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply watched her. When she blinked, it vanished. From then on, her entries grew more desperate. Night after night, she wrote the same sentence at the bottom of each page: "It comes at 3:13. Then, abruptly, her journal stopped. Blank pages stretched on for months. In one book, entire sections had been torn out, as if she wanted to erase something too terrible to remember. By 1935, Eleanor was dead. The official cause was listed as heart failure in her sleep. But in town, whispers began. Her son, Richard, inherited the farmhouse. He, too, kept journals. At first, his entries were practical repairs on the roof, plans for the farm. But soon his words took on the same haunted quality as his mother's. Richard never heard footsteps. His torment came through reflections. He claimed that in every mirror of the farmhouse, he saw something standing behind him. Sometimes it was tall and faceless, like the figure his mother described. Other times, it appeared as warped silhouettes, shapes of people he didn't recognize. In one entry he wrote, "I smashed the bathroom mirror. The glass fell in shards, but each piece showed it standing closer, closer." Watching, desperate, Richard covered the mirrors in the house with sheets. He avoided windows, pools of water, anything that could reflect. But it followed him everywhere. In the storefront glass of town, in the still water of the farm's well, even in the reflection of his own eyes. One passage, written shakily, reads, "It knows when I look away. It waits for me to notice. I don't think it blinks." His final entries were nearly illegible. Scribbled words, repeated phrases, half-finished thoughts. Michael sees it too, but he doesn't understand. Richard was found dead in his bed. The coroner's report was inconclusive. Michael was his son. He was just a child when the figure began appearing in his drawings. His teachers grew concerned. Every page of his notebooks was filled with the same shape, a tall, faceless figure standing in doorways, looming over sleeping children, reaching from the corners of rooms. When asked what it was, Michael simply replied, "The Watcher." As he grew older, he stopped drawing it. But his younger sister, Anna, claimed to see it as well. According to her later testimony, she often woke to find Michael sitting up in bed, staring at the doorway. When she asked what he was looking at, he whispered, "Don't let it know you see it." The Whitmore children were not alone in their fear. Neighbors reported strange events in the farmhouse. Visitors spoke of sudden drops in temperature, footsteps pacing in empty rooms, and the feeling of being observed. A traveling preacher who stayed with the family for 2 nights later refused to return. He described an overwhelming presence in the house, one that seemed to weigh on the soul. The stories spread. Some called the Whitmores cursed. Others whispered of madness, of hereditary illness. But no one could deny the consistency of the accounts. By the 1950s, the farmhouse stood empty. The Whitmore descendants moved away, but the presence seemed to follow. Letters from distant relatives describe the same phenomena. Mirrors that felt wrong, shadows moving just out of sight, waking at 3:13 a.m., with the sensation of being watched. One distant cousin wrote in 1964, "I woke to find a man standing at the foot of my bed. I could not move. I could not scream. He leaned close, and though he had no face, I knew he was smiling." Another letter, dated 1972, reads, "My daughter speaks to someone in the room at night. She says it's the tall man. I told her not to tell me any more. I don't want to know. So what was it?" Skeptics argue that the Whitmores suffered from sleep paralysis, a terrifying, unnatural condition that can create the illusion of shadowy figures passed down through generations. The stories could have reinforced the belief, spreading like a family legend. Psychologists suggest hereditary mental illness, schizophrenia, shared delusions, or a phenomenon known as folie du madness transmitted between people who live closely together. But others are not so sure. Paranormal researchers propose that the Whitmores were not cursed, but marked. That something attached itself not to the house, but to the bloodline itself. A presence that chose them, for reasons no one can explain. And then there are the stranger theories. Some point to declassified government experiments programs like McCultra, in which families were unknowingly subjected to psychological manipulation, drugs, and sleep deprivation. Could the Whitmores have been test subjects? Could the figure have been a construct of their fractured perception? Others whisper of something older, that the Whitmores may have stumbled upon a ritual, or broken a taboo, binding their family to an entity that watched them across generations. Not a ghost, not a demon, but something far more alien. One fringe theory suggests that the Whitmores were not hunted, but observed. That the figure was not a tormentor, but a research-ran interdimensional being studying human lives as if they were experiments. Watching, recording, waiting. Today, the Whitmore farmhouse lies in ruin. The roof has collapsed. The windows are shattered. Weeds choke the foundation. But even now, those who trespass report the same unsettling sensations. The air grows colder inside. Shadows seem longer, and always the impression that someone is standing just out of sight. The Whitmore descendants rarely speak of their past, but in hushed tones, some admit that the presence never left them. They don't describe footsteps, or mirrors, or faceless figures. They describe a silence, a wait, a knowing. One descendant, in an interview never released publicly, said, "I don't talk about it because it listens. Even now, I can feel it watching me. It's patient. It always has been. So was it madness, trauma echoing through memory? Or was it something else, something real, that latched onto a family nearly a century ago and refuses to let go? If something chose to watch you, how would you ever know? And more importantly, how would you ever escape? Because some truths were never meant to be found. This was lost Veracity.